this isn't about Lewis Goodall specifically. This is a wider story, of course. It's about the BBC. It's found itself yet again at the centre of an impartiality row after their policy editor, for that is his title, wrote an article for the left-wing magazine, The New Statesman, in the piece that was billed on the cover as an examination of how the government's ineptitude created a lost generation and was headlined How a Government Led by Technocrats Nearly Destroyed a Generation of Social Mobility. Despite facing widespread criticism across social media platforms, the article was actually signed off by BBC management, who insisted it fell within its impartiality guidelines. I know those guidelines. I've looked at those guidelines. I'm struggling. Let's speak to two people who might be able to help us out here. Aman Bhogal, who is a Conservative commentator, and Steve Pears, Professor of EU Law and Human Rights at Essex University. Steve, afternoon to you. Well, maybe you could help me out to start with. What didn't Lewis Goodall do?
Well, good afternoon. Well, having read that article, it does actually criticise other devolved governments, and Lewis Goodall does point out that there's a Labour government in Wales with a Lib Dem education minister and so on. So all of them made, you could say, the same mistake or the same unpopularity. It's not full of the kind of rhetoric that you would get from the Labour Party, as the Tories are terrible, let's vote them out and so on. It's more about an analysis of the policy, which obviously ended up being unpopular, and the government changed it. So it's an analysis of the background to that. I don't see it as quite so lacking in impartiality as some people do.
Do you not think it's, okay, do you not think it's a bit iffy, though? I mean, if you don't think it crosses the line, you must concede it gets a bit close.
Well, it may get close, but then we have to be consistent. I mean, Andrew Marr wrote in the same news magazine, "Isn't Brexit wonderful?" a couple of years ago. Obviously, some people agree with that, some people don't. It's a very controversial issue. Should Andrew Marr be saying that? Well, shouldn't we criticise him? Shouldn't we criticise Andrew Neil for being the chairman of a Conservative magazine, The Spectator, if we're going to start saying that BBC journalists shouldn't write in magazines?
But Andrew Neil doesn't. Andrew Neil doesn't write anything. I don't know what Andrew Marr wrote or in what context he wrote it, put it that way. It seems quite blatant to say, isn't Brexit great, doesn't it, for your political editor to write that, or former political editor?
Well, basically it was, let's look at all the positives of Brexit. Remainers only complain about the negatives. Let's hear all the positives. So that was the whole...
Well, that sounds like a breach as well then, doesn't it? I mean, that sounds like an overt breach of their regulations.
Yes, but when I criticised that at the time, a lot of people came back and said, well, the BBC's charter doesn't cover that sort of thing. He's not on BBC Time there. They're allowed to go and write whatever they like for other newspapers.
But that's not true, is it?
Well, I mean, people claimed that. I had my doubts at the time. It certainly doesn't look impartial.
There used to be, I've got a funny feeling, I stand to be corrected, that it was something that John Humphreys once wrote that changed the, I can't remember which head honcho at the BB it was that stepped in and changed it, but put a block essentially on news presenters and the like writing in national newspapers.
Well, I agree. If that's the rule, then it should be enforced across the board, because almost every national newspaper is seen as somewhere on the political spectrum, whether it's obviously the Mail or the Sun or the Guardian. Then you should apply it across the board. So I don't know why an exception was made here. Perhaps the argument was this was a more neutral analysis. And of course, remember, he didn't write the headline.
No, but that's a hell of a risk to take, isn't it? To let a policy editor write something in a magazine knowing that a left-wing sort of anti-government organisation magazine is likely to put an unfavourable headline to it. Aman Bhogal, just give us your comments on this. I mean, Steve there saying that he doesn't really think there's much to see here.
Well, look, this boils down to one big thing, trust. And this is about trust in the BBC being impartial. And above all, look, there's nothing wrong with being a commentator, but there is something very wrong with being a commentator on politics and then also being a supposedly impartial BBC Newsnight policy editor. That's what the crux of the matter is.
That's the tricky bit, isn't it? It's not as if he's not a backroom boy, Steve Pears, is he? He's a policy editor. It's extraordinary that he's even got close to accepting an offer to write something, surely. Can you hear us, Steve?
Same standards to everyone, like Andrew Marr and so on. There's obviously a perception of lack of impartiality that some people have about Andrew Neil, some of his comments about social media calling the journalist cat lady, things like that, which then the BBC apologised for on his behalf, obviously blurs the line as to when he is acting on behalf of the BBC and when he isn't. And, if you're going to have a line, fine, that may make sense. But let's have it perfectly clear and apply it perfectly consistently, and maybe then, that will address some of these concerns about impartiality.
And Aman, on that point, I mean, do the BBC need to get tougher then in that respect and be more unequivocal about what their policy is?
Well, I think the BBC simply needs to apply its own guidelines. And as you mentioned a few times earlier, this piece from Lewis Goodall expressed very strong views about a policy. It advocates against a policy, and it even exhorts a change in public political policy. And those three things are within the BBC's own guidelines. And I think, above all, I don't understand why TV license fee payers should be compelled to pay through law for any live TV they might want to watch, for a BBC Newsnight policy editor to be doing commentating.
Yeah. Should he be commentating in any shape or form, Steve Pearce? Final point.
Well, I think if you're the policy editor on Newsnight and a big government policy has been criticised and the government itself did a U-turn, it makes sense to explain the reasons why. But I agree, it's going to be hard to do so in a way which doesn't end up looking critical of the government, because this was an unpopular policy that got changed.
Steve, thank you. Professor Steve Pearce, Professor of EU Law, Human Rights at Essex University. The other voice you heard there was Aman Bhogal, Conservative commentator. Over to you on this. I mean, you would look at this and say, well, it's not the greatest breach, surely. The fact is, there's 2 points to that. Number one, it's the second in just months from the same programme. And I think that's quite telling in itself. It's almost like Newsnight, some kind of island over their broadcasting house. And secondly, it is the policy editor, a senior journalistic position, somebody who absolutely would have known what he was doing and signed off by the BBC management, who said this is fine. Now, I've read the article. I don't think anybody could read the article and say, well, it covers lots of other things. I get that. But it does opine. There is no doubt about it that there is opinion dripping through this piece that Lewis Goodall wrote. He's not allowed to do that. And this does nothing. I mean, for the BBC who at the moment are fighting for their very existence, particularly in reputation as much as anything else. So in terms of you, the licence payer, how do you feel when you see a story like this? Look, this story is small compared to everything that's going on in the world. I get that. But it's totemic in another respect within the annals of this discussion about the BBC. Do you still trust the state broadcaster? 0344 499 1000.